Out on the blood-red plains of the Texas Panhandle, where the sky is a merciless empty bowl and history is written in dust and bone, a story was etched that defies belief. It's a tale whispered only in the deepest canyons, a legend the land itself has tried to keep secret. This isn't about cowboys and simple cattle drives. It's about the day the prehistoric past roared back to life, crashing into the unforgiving present. It's the story of a lone girl, a forgotten herd of impossible beasts, and a warrior caught between two worlds. What happened in that lonely canyon changed everything, proving that the wildest tales are the ones the West has yet to tell. The sun was a malevolent eye in the vast, bleached canvas of the sky, beating down on the solitary cabin with the force of a blacksmith's hammer. Karina Hayes squinted her gaze, sweeping the horizon, where the heat shimmered like a phantom river, distorting the familiar shapes of juniper and rock. At 19, her world had shrunk to the size of this homestead, a stubborn patch of defiance carved out of the unforgiving Llano Estacado by her late father, a man as tough and weathered as the land itself. He'd left her two things of value, this cabin built of sturdy cottonwood and the Winchester rifle that now rested comfortably in the crook of her arm. Loneliness was a constant companion, a presence as real as the dust that coated every surface. It was in the mournful cry of the wind whistling through the eaves of the cabin, and in the profound silence that fell after sunset, a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. But Karina had learned to distinguish the land's normal language, the skittering of a lizard, the rustle of a snake in the dry grass, the distant yip of a coyote from the sounds that signaled trouble. This sound was different. It began as a low, almost subsonic vibration that she felt more than heard a tremor that resonated through the soles of her worn leather boots. It wasn't the distant rumble of a summer storm. This was a rhythmic terrestrial pulse, deep and guttural. Karina's hand tightened on the Winchester. Her father, Harrison Hayes, had filled her head with stories, some tall, some true. He spoke of phantom herds and strange lights in the sky, but he'd also taught her the practical catechism of survival. Trust your senses, question the impossible, and always be ready to fight or flee. She climbed the small rocky outcrop behind the cabin, the vantage point her father had called his crow's nest. From here she could see for miles, her view encompassing the rolling plains that eventually fractured and fell away into the maw of the Whispering Chasm, a labyrinthine canyon system that few men had ever fully explored. It was from the direction of the chasm that the sound was growing, graduating from a tremor to a deep, rolling thunder that had nothing to do with the weather. A plume of red dust, thick and angry, boiled up from the canyon's rim, rising against the azure sky like a signal fire. It wasn't the dust of a cattle drive. It was too violent, too concentrated. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the growing roar. She raised her father's old spyglass to her eye, the brass cool against her skin. The lens trembled in her hand as she focused, sweeping past the familiar rock formations until she found the source. And then she saw them. The breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. Her mind refused to process the image, to reconcile it with reality. They were behemoths, gargantuan shapes of shaggy, umber-colored fur, moving with the inexorable force of a glacier. Great, curved tusks, some longer than a man, was tall, sliced through the air. Their heads were domed, their backs sloped down from massive shoulders. Mammoths. The word was a ghost in her mind, a creature from a book, a fossilized bone. Yet here they were, a living, breathing, thundering impossibility pouring out of a side canyon and stampeding across the plateau. They were a force of nature, unleashed a forgotten army from a lost world. The ground shook with their passage, and the air was filled with a primal symphony of trumpeting cries and the percussive impact of colossal feet. It was terrifying and magnificent, a vision so overwhelming it bordered on the divine. Then through the dust and chaos, her spyglass caught a flash of movement that didn't belong. It was smaller, leaner, a figure on horseback, riding parallel to the herd, seemingly trying to turn them. A warrior. His bare torso was streaked with paint, his long black hair flying behind him. He rode with a desperate grace, his body a seamless extension of the painted stallion beneath him. He was losing. The herd was too big, too panicked. As she watched, a massive bull at the edge of the herd swerved its colossal head, swinging. The horse, a brave and beautiful animal, reared in terror. The warrior fought for control, but it was too late. The mammoth's tusk caught the horse's flank, a sickening, glancing blow that sent the animal screaming to the ground. The rider was thrown a rag doll in the face of the avalanche. He landed hard, tried to rise, and then collapsed as the river of fur and bone flowed around him. The herd was a wall of motion, 100 tons of stampeding death. Miraculously, the main body of the herd parted just enough to miss, trampling him directly, the beasts on either side of him, creating a tiny, fleeting island of safety in the churning river of panicked flesh. But he was trapped. A few stragglers, calves, and younger adults still thundered behind the main group. He was injured, helpless, and directly in their path. Corina didn't think. The time for thought was over. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a low and steady rumble. You don't stand by when a life's on the line. Not man, not beast. You act. She slid down from the rock, her boots finding purchase in the familiar dirt. The Winchester felt less like a tool and more like a part of her arm. She knew the terrain, knew the way the land folded and creased. She knew a shortcut, a dangerous game trail that cut down toward the plateau where the warrior lay. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to let the impossible scene play out and erase itself from the landscape. But the sight of the lone figure, vulnerable and broken amidst a force he could not control, had struck a chord deep within her. She knew what it was to be alone against the overwhelming power of the world. Sprinting with a speed born of adrenaline and familiarity, she plunged into the brush, the thunder of the mammoths, now a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very marrow in her bones. She was no longer just Corina Hayes, the orphan homesteader. She was a girl running toward a herd of living fossils to save a man she did not know, propelled by a legacy of courage she had to prove was her own. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of dust and sound. Corina's lungs burned each breath, a searing intake of grit and panic. The game trail was treacherous, a narrow ribbon of certainty in a chaotic world. Jagged rocks tore at her leather breeches, and thorny mesquite branches clawed at her arms, leaving angry red welts. The ground itself seemed to be alive, shuddering with the colossal footfalls of the passing herd. The trumpeting cries of the beasts were sharp and piercing the sound of ancient rage and fear. She burst from the trail onto the edge of the plateau, just as the last of the main herd thundered past the fallen warrior. He was a still point in the swirling chaos, a broken form lying perilously close to the path of the stragglers. A half-dozen younger mammoths, still massive and utterly deadly, were bearing down on his position. She had seconds. Her mind worked with the cold, clear precision that her father had drilled into her. Fear was a luxury. Survival was a series of calculations. She raised the Winchester, the stock pressed hard against her shoulder. She wouldn't shoot the beasts. It felt like sacrilege, like shooting a ghost. Besides, a single bullet would only enrage them. She needed to divert them. Her eyes scanned the terrain. To her right, a sheer rock face rose up, peppered with loose scree and boulders. An idea desperate and dangerous took hold. Firing at the beasts was foolish. Firing at the rock face was a calculated risk. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim high above the approaching mammoths, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Winchester was sharp and thin against the overwhelming bass of the stampede. The bullet sparked against the rock, whining off into the chaos. Nothing. She levered another round into the chamber, aimed higher this time, searching for a precariously balanced slab of stone she'd noticed 100 times before. She fired again. This time the bullet struck true. The slab shuddered, and with a groan of stressed rock it gave way. A cascade of smaller rocks and scree tumbled down the cliff face, creating a sudden sharp clatter that cut through the thunder of hooves. It wasn't a landslide, not by a long shot, but it was enough. The lead straggler, a young bull with developing tusks, shied violently at the unexpected noise and the shower of stone to its right. It veered sharply to the left, its panic infectious. The others followed its lead, their path altering by a precious dozen yards, just enough to bypass the spot where the warrior lay. They galloped past their immense bodies, casting fleeting shadows over him, and then they were gone, following the main herd into the haze of dust. Silence descended heavy and absolute, broken only by the ringing in Karina's ears and her own ragged breathing. The dust began to settle, a red veil slowly lifting from the scene. The warrior hadn't moved. She approached him cautiously, Winchester held at the ready. The plains were a treacherous place. A trick was as deadly as a bullet. But as she drew closer, she saw his vulnerability was no act. He lay crumpled, his face pressed into the dirt. A dark, jagged gash ran along his temple, already matted with blood and dust. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him, the bone clearly broken. His magnificent horse lay a short distance away, its suffering mercifully over. Kneeling beside him, Karina gently rolled him onto his back. His face was a mask of hard angles and proud lines, even in unconsciousness. His skin was the color of rich earth, his chest broad and powerful. Intricate faded tattoos coiled around one of his biceps. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than she was. He was an enemy by any common definition of the word on this frontier. His people and hers were locked in a constant simmering conflict over land, water, and life itself. But here now he was just a man broken by a force that belonged to a different age of the world. She checked his breathing. It was shallow but steady. The head wound was backed, but the leg was worse. Leaving him here was a death sentence. The sun would kill him if the predators didn't. The decision was made before the thought was fully formed. Harrison Hayes wouldn't have left a dog to die like this. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial of strength, and will she hadn't known she possessed. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She couldn't carry him. Instead, she used her belt and his own to rig a crude travois, lashing his ankles together and looping the leather over her shoulders. She then began the agonizing process of dragging him inch by painstaking inch across the scorched earth and back up the trail toward her homestead. Every step was a battle. The sun beat down relentlessly. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her throat was a desert. But she gritted her teeth and pulled her focus narrowed to the single desperate task. By the time she hauled him over the threshold of her cabin, the shadows were lengthening, and her body felt like one giant throbbing bruise. She laid him on her father's cot, the only spare bed she had. Working by the fading light, she began to tend to his wounds with a practiced efficiency. She cleaned the gash on his head with carbolic soap and precious water from her barrel, stitching it closed with a fine needle, and gut her father had used for mending hides. The work was grisly, but her hands were steady. Setting the leg was the worst part. She had to force herself to be ruthless, using 2 stout pieces of cottonwood for a splint and strips of linen for binding. She braced herself, took a firm hold of his ankle and thigh, and pulled. An agonized groan escaped his lips, the first sound he'd made, and his body arched in a spasm of pure agony, but he did not wake. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked, her jaw clenched tight. When it was done, the leg was straight and immobile, but his face was pale, his breathing ragged. She covered him with a thin blanket and collapsed into a chair, every fiber of her being humming with exhaustion. She watched him as the last light of day bled from the sky, turning the world outside her window to shades of indigo and charcoal. He was a stranger, a potential danger, and now he was utterly dependent on her. The silence of the cabin felt different now, charged with his presence. Hours later, in the dead of night, he woke. His eyes snapped open, dark and sharp, with immediate feral awareness. They locked onto her where she sat, dozing in the chair, the Winchester across her lap. He tried to sit up, a guttural cry of pain tearing from his throat as the fire in his leg and head exploded. "Easy," Karina said, her voice low and calm. She didn't raise the rifle, but she didn't put it down either. "You're safe. For now." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and agony. He looked around the small rustic cabin, at the neatly stacked firewood, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the single bookshelf filled with her father's worn volumes. His gaze fell to his splintered leg, then back to her. He spoke, his voice a hoarse rasp, in a language she didn't understand. The words were hard and clipped. "I don't speak your tongue," she said simply. "English." He remained silent for a long moment, his eyes boring into hers, trying to read her, to understand the impossible situation he found himself in. Finally, he gave a curt, reluctant nod. "Who are you?" he asked, the English words heavily accented but clear. "Karina Hayes. This is my home." "The beasts," he rasped, his eyes flickering as if seeing the memory again. "The thunder behemoths." "Mammoths," she corrected softly. "I saw what happened. You were thrown." He processed this, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Mistrust was etched into every line of his features. "You pulled me from their path." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a debt he never intended to incur. "I did," she confirmed. "Why?" The single word was laced with 1,000 years of conflict between their peoples. "Why would one of you save one of us?" Karina looked at the man on the cot, the warrior, the enemy. She thought of her father's words, of the simple, unshakable morality he had hammered into her. "Out here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't let a man die if you can help it. That's the only law that matters." He fell silent again, his pride warring with the undeniable truth of his situation. He owed his life to this lone white woman, with the steady hands and the watchful eyes. It was a debt written in crimson, a complication neither of them could have foreseen. Outside, the moonless night was absolute, and in the shared silence of the cabin, a fragile, dangerous truce was born. The dawn came, not with gentle pastels, but with a stark, brutal light that washed over the plains, erasing the soft shadows of night. Karina had not slept. She'd spent the hours in her chair, watching the warrior, who she now knew was named Coda, drift in and out of a restless, pain-filled sleep. An unspoken tension filled the small cabin, thick and suffocating. She was his savior, but she was also his captor. He was her patient, but he was also her enemy. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt amplified. She was outside, checking the water level in her rain barrel, when she felt it again. A subtle vibration in the ground, a rhythmic thudding that was not the thunder of mammoths. This was the sound of horses, many of them approaching at a deliberate, steady pace. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the Winchester and darted to the corner of the cabin, peering around the edge. They were silhouetted against the rising sun, a dozen riders cresting the low rise to the east. They were not cowboys or soldiers. They were warriors, Coda's people, moving with a disciplined grace that spoke of immense power. At their head rode a man who commanded attention, even at a distance. He was older, his bearing regal and severe, a magnificent feathered headdress, marking him as a man of great authority. There was no question of who they were or why they were here. They were looking for their lost warrior. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This could go one of two ways. They might see her actions as a kindness, an unexpected mercy, or they would see a white woman with their injured brave and assume the worst, that she was responsible for his state, that this was an ambush. Her father had always warned her, an act of kindness could easily be misinterpreted as an act of war on the frontier. There was no time to run, nowhere to hide. Her home was her fortress, and she would not abandon it. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she stepped out from behind the cabin, the Winchester held in a non-threatening position, its barrel pointed toward the ground. She would meet them on her own terms, standing on her own land. The riders fanned out as they approached, their movements fluid and coordinated, forming a silent, menacing semicircle around her small homestead. They were a formidable sight, their faces set like stone, their eyes missing nothing. The man at their center, the chief, rode forward until he was just 20 yards from her. He dismounted with a fluid motion that belied his age, and stood, his presence immense, dwarfing the landscape around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles and deep-seated authority. His eyes dark and piercing, fixed on her, stripping away all pretense. "You are the woman who lives on this land," he stated, his voice a low rumble like distant rockfall. It was not a question. He knew who she was. They had been watching this place, perhaps for years. "I am," Corina replied, her own voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "This is the Hayes homestead. My father built it." "Your father is gone," the chief said, his gaze unwavering. "Now you are alone." The statement sent a chill down her spine. They knew everything. "I have a guest," she said, deciding that honesty, however dangerous, was her only weapon. "A warrior of your tribe. He was injured. His horse was killed in a stampede." The chief's expression did not change, but a flicker of something assessment calculation passed through his eyes. He took a step forward. "I am Chief Iron Talon. The warrior you speak of is my son Coda." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. She had not just saved a random warrior. She had saved the son of the powerful leader who now stood before her like a judge. This raised the stakes immeasurably. "He is inside," Corina said. "His leg is broken. I've set it. His head is wounded. I've stitched it." Iron Talon turned and issued a sharp command in his own tongue. Two warriors dismounted and strode past Corina into the cabin without so much as a glance at her. She stood her ground, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. To interfere would be suicide. She could only wait. A few agonizing moments later, the warriors emerged, speaking rapidly to their chief. Iron Talon's gaze returned to her, and this time it was different. It was sharper, more intense. He was not here just to retrieve his son. There was something else at play, a deeper current of purpose she could not yet fathom. "You have shown him a kindness I would not have expected from your people," the chief said, his tone still hard, devoid of gratitude. "You tended his wounds. This is true. Karina simply nodded, her throat too dry to speak. But you have also seen something that was not meant for your eyes. He continued, his voice dropping, taking on a dangerous edge. My son was not hunting deer. He was tracking the thunder behemoths. You saw them. Again, it was not a question. The dust cloud her tracks leading from the crow's nest. They would have seen it all. They were expert trackers. I saw them, she admitted quietly. Iron Talon took another step closer, his presence almost overwhelming. For generations, my people have been the guardians of that secret. The thunder behemoths are sacred. They are the living spirit of the earth, a memory from the dawn of time. Their existence is a covenant between us and the Creator. A secret we have killed to protect. A secret we have died to protect. The air grew heavy with unspoken threat. This was not a conversation. It was an interrogation. Her act of mercy had not earned her a reprieve. It had made her a liability. Now, the chief said, his voice as cold and sharp as a flint knife, you hold that secret in your head. A secret whispered in the wrong place in your town of redemption could bring an army of white hunters and fortune seekers. It would be the end of them, the end of a world. Karina finally understood. He hadn't come to thank her. He hadn't even come just to rescue his son. He had come to deal with her, to silence the witness. The warriors surrounding her were not an honor guard. They were an execution squad. The life she had saved had, in a terrible twist of fate, sealed the warrant for her own death. The sun was fully up now, but the world had never felt colder or darker. A chief stood at her door, not as a grateful father, but as a judge who held her life in his hands. The silence stretched thin and brittle. Karina's mind raced, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The dozen warriors were statues of lethal intent, their eyes fixed on her. Chief Iron Talon stood before her, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes held the weight of a grim, unavoidable duty. "What will you do?" Karina asked, the words barely a whisper, yet they cut through the morning stillness. It was a challenge, a plea and a statement of defiance all in one. She would not beg. Before the chief could answer, a voice strained with pain came from the cabin doorway. "Father." Coda stood there, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face pale and beaded with sweat. The two warriors who had gone inside now flanked him, supporting his weight. His eyes, though clouded with fever and agony, were clear with purpose. He looked from his father to Karina, a silent conversation passing between them. Iron Talon turned his head slowly, his gaze softening, almost imperceptibly, as he looked at his son. "You should not be standing. I will not lie down while you threaten the woman who saved my life," Coda said, his English deliberate and strong despite the pain. "There is a debt. It must be honored. The debt to our people, to the sacred trust, is older and greater." Iron Talon countered, his voice resonating with authority. "Her knowledge is a poison that can destroy everything we protect." "Then we must find an antidote, not kill the patient," Coda argued, wincing as he shifted his weight. She did not seek this knowledge. It fell upon her, as the mammoth's tusk fell upon my horse. She acted with honor when she could have left me to the buzzards. Does our honor not demand we act in kind? The tension between father and son was a palpable force. The other warriors watched, their faces unreadable, waiting for their chief's decision. Iron Talon's gaze shifted back to Karina, studying her with a new intensity. He was weighing the life of one woman against the survival of a secret that defined his people. "There is more," the chief said, his voice low and grave, directed as much to his son as to Karina. Your timing was not a mischance, my son. And your presence here," he said, locking eyes with Corina, "is no longer a simple matter of a lone homesteader. There are others. New threats." He gestured for his men to bring water. As Coda drank, Iron Talon began to speak, his words painting a grim picture. "For 2 moons we have tracked shadows in the canyons, men who are not soldiers or prospectors. They move with quiet skill, and they carry spyglasses and large rifles we have not seen before. They leave behind strange metal traps and survey markers. They are not hunting buffalo. They are hunting a legend." Corina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "Who are they?" "We call them the Ghost Men," Iron Talon said. "They are led by a man with a cold fire in his eyes, a hunter of men. And he serves another, a man from the east, they say. A wealthy man obsessed with collecting the rare and the impossible. A man who heard the same whispers on the wind that my people have guarded for centuries, and unlike others, he believed them." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They are closing in. We believe they have found the herd's grazing grounds in the deep chasm. Your rescue of my son, the Stampede, it was not random. Coda was attempting to drive the herd away from the area where he had found signs of the Ghost Men. He believes they spooked the herd, causing the stampede that nearly killed him." The pieces clicked into place. The mammoths, Coda's desperate ride, her discovery, it was all part of a larger, more dangerous puzzle. She was no longer just a witness. She was now standing at the epicenter of a conflict she couldn't possibly have imagined. These men, Corina began thinking aloud. If they're from the east, they won't just kill one and leave. They'll want a trophy. Maybe more than one. They'll want to capture one alive. They'll bring crews, build roads. They'll expose the whole canyon. Iron Talon nodded grimly. They will turn our sacred place into a circus, a slaughterhouse. They will destroy the behemoths, and with them a part of our soul. This is the threat we now face, and you, Corina Hayes, are now part of it. Your homestead sits at the gateway to the very canyon they seek to exploit." The dynamic had shifted completely. A moment ago she was a prisoner awaiting her sentence. Now she was a potential, albeit unwilling, ally. Her knowledge of the immediate area, the trails her father had shown her, the hidden springs, the rock falls waiting to happen, it was all priceless information. She was a liability, but she was also a strategic asset. Coda spoke again, his voice firm. "She can be trusted, father. I feel it. Her spirit is strong like the land itself. She does not have the greed of the men you describe." Iron Talon continued to study her, his mind working behind his impenetrable gaze. He saw the strength in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes. He saw the calloused hands of a woman who worked the land, not one who sought to conquer it. He saw the Winchester she held, not as a threat, but as a tool of survival, much like his own warriors' bows and lances. "The world is changing," the chief said at last, a note of weariness in his voice. "Perhaps our ways of protecting the secret must change with it." He looked at Corina, a final decision made. "Your life is no longer forfeit, but it is no longer your own. You are now bound to this secret, to this fight. You will help us. Your knowledge of this place will be our eyes and ears." It wasn't a request. It was a command, a conscription into a war she never knew existed. To refuse was to die. To accept was to plunge herself into a conflict against skilled, ruthless men with her only allies, a band of warriors who just moments before were prepared to kill her. "My father always said you can't choose the trouble that finds you," Corina said, her voice finding its strength again. "You can only choose how you face it." She looked from the proud, wounded warrior in the doorway to the formidable chief before her. "Tell me what you need me to do." A covenant had been made, not of friendship, not yet, but of necessity. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the plains, the lone woman and the Comanche chief began to lay the plans for a desperate defense of a prehistoric world hidden in the heart of the American West. The next few days passed in a blur of hushed conversations, shared maps drawn in the dirt, and a constant thrumming tension. Karina's cabin transformed from a solitary outpost into the nerve center of a secret war, while Coda recovered his leg, healing with remarkable speed under the care of his people's medicine man, a quiet warrior named Stone Hand. He and Karina became the bridge between two worlds. He would speak of the thunder behemoths, not as beasts, but as ancient relatives describing their migration patterns through the canyons, their sacred watering holes, their deep, resonant songs that his people believed spoke of the world's creation. In turn, Karina shared her father's knowledge. She knew the Whispering Chasm, not as a sacred place, but as a geological puzzle. She pointed out choke points, box canyons with no escape, and treacherous scree slopes that could be turned into devastating rock slides with a few well-placed charges of dynamite from her father's small, carefully preserved stash. A plan began to form, born of Coda's reverence and Karina's pragmatism. They couldn't fight the ghost men head-on. The Easterners, led by the ruthless hunter, Clayton Rourke, and funded by the obsessive collector Beauregard Finch, would have superior firepower. Their only chance was to use the land itself as their primary weapon. They had to outthink them to lead them on a wild goose chase, while they guided the mammoth herd to a different, more remote canyon system. Miles to the south, a place so inaccessible it was marked on old Spanish maps simply as Tierra del Diablo, the Devil's Land. Iron Talon dispatched his best scouts, silent wraiths, who moved through the landscape unseen to track Rourke's party. They returned with grim news. The ghost men were methodical and efficient. They had established a base camp near the mouth of the main canyon, complete with heavy wagons, sturdy tents, and a small army of hired guns. They were using advanced surveying equipment and had already started blasting a crude path for their wagons. They were not merely exploring, they were invading. They move with the arrogance of men who believe the world belongs to them. Iron Talon said, his voice laced with contempt as he studied the scout's drawing. They foul the water and leave their filth behind for the land to choke on. The night before, they were set to put their plan into motion, a hunter's moon full, and blood orange rose over the plains, bathing the landscape in an ethereal glow. Karina stood outside her cabin, the air crisp and cool. Coda joined her, moving quietly on a crude but effective crutch one of his warriors had fashioned for him. "You are worried," he said, his voice soft. "They have repeating rifles, dynamite resources we can't imagine," she replied, her gaze fixed on the distant dark gash of the canyon. "We have bows, old rifles, and knowledge. I'm not sure it's an even fight." "A fight is never even," Coda said. "It is weighed by the spirit of the combatants. They fight for greed, a rich man's prize to be mounted on a wall. We fight for the soul of the land, for the memory of our ancestors. That gives our spirit a weight they cannot match." He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "And we have you. You see the land not just with your heart, as we do, but with your mind. You see its angles, its weaknesses. You see it as a weapon." His words struck her. He was right. Her father had taught her to read the land for survival, where to find water, how to predict rock slides, which paths were stable. Now she was being asked to read it for war. The plan was twofold and incredibly dangerous. Coda, despite his injury, would lead a small party of warriors, including Stonehand, into the canyon. Their task was to find the herd, and using their ancient knowledge of calls and scent markings, begin subtly nudging them south, away from Rourke's advance, and toward the network of canyons leading to the Devil's Land. Meanwhile, Corina and a second party of warriors led by a fierce, taciturn brave named Black Hawk would act as a diversion. Their job was to harass, mislead, and delay Rourke's party, making them believe the herd was moving north, deeper into a complex, dead-end box canyon. Corina's role was crucial. She would identify the best places for Black Hawk's men to create false tracks, start minor rock slides to block paths, and generally make Rourke's life a living hell without ever engaging in a direct fight. It was a game of shadows and whispers designed to prey on the hunter's arrogance. The next morning, under the cloak of a pre-dawn mist, they separated. Corina, clad in her father's durable buckskins and carrying her Winchester, felt a strange sense of belonging as she rode alongside Black Hawk and his 5 warriors. They moved with a profound silence that amazed her, their ponies making scarcely a sound on the rocky ground. For 2 days they played their deadly game. Following Corina's directions, they found a narrow pass, and using ropes and brute force, hauled a dead juniper tree across it, making it look like a recent natural rockfall had blocked the way. Miles away they diverted a small stream, turning a dry wash, Rourke's most likely path, into a muddy bog that would mire his heavy wagons for hours. At night, warriors would sneak close to the ghost men's camp, mimicking the calls of predators to spook their horses and fray their nerves. On the 3rd day their luck almost ran out. Corina was scouting a high ridge, peering down through her spyglass at Rourke's slow-moving expedition. She could make out the figures clearly now. Clayton Rourke was a tall man in practical dusty clothes who moved with a predator's economy of motion. Beside him, Beauregard Finch looked comical in his expensive East Coast hunting gear, gesturing wildly, his frustration visible even from a mile away. As she watched, she saw a glint of light from a rock formation much closer to her position. Rourke had sent out his own scouts. A lone rifleman was carefully making his way up a parallel ridge, hoping to get a vantage point, and he was moving directly toward her hiding place. Her heart leapt into her throat. Black Hawk and his men were a quarter mile away, setting another snare. She was alone. She flattened herself behind a cluster of boulders, her breathing shallow. The scout was methodical, moving from cover to cover. He was good. In 10 minutes, he would be on top of her. She had one chance. To her left was a steep drop-off, a sheer 50-foot fall onto a rock-strewn ledge below. But nestled in the cliff face was a narrow chimney, a vertical crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through a shortcut to the canyon floor her father had shown her once. It was her only escape route. Waiting until the scout was momentarily obscured by an outcrop of rock, she moved. She didn't run. She crawled silent and swift over the loose shale toward the chimney. Pebbles skittered under her hands. She froze, listening. Had he heard? After a moment of terrifying silence, she heard him continue his advance. She reached the edge of the cliff and, without a second's hesitation, slipped into the rock chimney. The descent was a nightmare. The rock tore at her clothes and skin. Her fingers, raw and bleeding, scrabbled for purchase. Her boots scraped against the stone, the sound echoing in the narrow space. She expected to hear a shout from above, the crack of a rifle at any moment. But none came. When her feet finally touched the solid ground of the ledge below, she was shaking her body, covered in scrapes. But she was alive and unseen. She had gambled and won. Later that evening, when she recounted the event to Black Hawk, he looked at her with a new level of respect. He had seen her as a guide, a map reader. Now he saw a survivor, a warrior in her own right. The whispers on the wind were no longer just about the coming threat. They were about the strange white woman who moved like a shadow and thought like a hunter. The moon rose again, no longer a hunter's moon, but a guardian's, watching over the disparate allies united in their desperate cause. The deception could not last forever. On the 5th day, a scout returned to Black Hawk's position, his face grim. Rourke was no fool. He had discovered their ruse. The manufactured tracks, the diversions he had finally seen through the pattern. His scouts had found the true trail of the Mammoth herd leading south. He had abandoned his heavy wagons and was now moving fast with a smaller elite force of a dozen hand-picked men pushing hard to intercept Coda's party before they could reach the safety of the Devil's Land. Worse, Rourke had correctly deduced their destination. The entrance to the Devil's Land was a narrow, winding canyon, no more than 50 yards across a natural bottleneck. Iron Talon had called it the Anvil. Rourke was no longer hunting. He was racing to spring a trap. If he reached the Anvil first and set up his riflemen on the cliffs above, he could pick off the mammoths and the warriors at his leisure. Coda and his party would be walking into a slaughter. There was no time to send a rider. Rourke's path was more direct. The only way to warn Coda was to beat the hunters to the Anvil. "Karina, you know the quickest path?" Black Hawk asked, his voice tight. She nodded her mind, already tracing the treacherous network of trails her father had shown her. "There is a way. It's not a horse trail. We go on foot. It's called the Serpent's Spine, a high ridge, narrow and dangerous, but it cuts 5 miles off the journey." There was no debate. Leaving their ponies behind, the small band of warriors followed Karina at a punishing pace. The Serpent's Spine was aptly named a razor-thin ridge of weathered rock with dizzying drops on either side. A ceaseless wind tore at them, threatening to peel them from the rock face. They moved for hours, their lungs screaming for air, their muscles burning. Karina, driven by a desperate urgency, pushed herself to the brink, matching the warriors stride for stride. They arrived at the cliffs overlooking the Anvil, with less than an hour to spare. Peering over the edge, Karina's heart sank. Rourke's men were already there. They were taking up positions on the opposite cliff, setting out ammunition, their long-range rifles glinting in the harsh sunlight. Rourke himself stood directing them, a confident, cold-blooded general, preparing for the final decisive battle. Below them, the canyon floor was empty, but Karina could feel it in the air. Coda and the herd were close. "We are too few." Black Hawk hissed his hand, gripping his bow. "They hold the high ground. To attack them here would be suicide." Karina's eyes scanned their surroundings, her mind racing, processing every detail of the terrain, as her father had taught her. The cliff face where they hid was fractured and unstable, a fact local tribes had known for centuries. High above them, precariously balanced, was a massive overhang of loose rock and shale, a disaster waiting to happen. Her gaze dropped to her satchel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 4 sticks of her father's dynamite and a length of fuse. He'd kept it for blasting stumps, a tool of creation. She was about to use it for destruction. "We don't attack them," she said, her voice low and intense. "We attack the mountain." She explained her desperate plan. It was incredibly risky. The fuse was old, its burn rate unpredictable. Setting the charge would mean exposing herself to enemy fire. But it was their only chance. Black Hawk listened, his eyes wide, and then a slow, fierce grin spread across his face. He understood. He gave a series of sharp, guttural commands to his men. They went to work. 2 warriors uncoiled their long, rawhide ropes, tying them together. while the others laid down covering fire, sending arrows across the chasm to harass Rourke's men and keep their heads down. Corrina prepared the charge. Her hands, slick with sweat, worked quickly, bundling the dynamite sticks together, inserting the fuse, and wrapping it all in a piece of her leather shirt to protect it from stray sparks. Black Hawk and another warrior anchored the rope. Corrina tied the other end around her waist, the dynamite satchel slung over her shoulder. "When I light the fuse, pull me back." "Fast," she said, the understatement of the century. Taking a deep breath, she scrambled over the edge of the cliff. The rope bit into her waist as she half climbed, half rappelled, down the 20 feet to a small ledge directly beneath the massive rock overhang. Across the canyon, a rifle shot rang out, the bullet smacking into the rock just inches from her head, showering her with stone dust. Rourke's men had spotted her. There was no more time for caution. Hanging precariously from the rope, she found a deep fissure in the rock, shoved the dynamite charge deep inside, and pulled out a match. The wind whipped at her, extinguishing the first one. Another shot whined past her ear. She struck a second match, cupping it with her body. The fuse caught, spitting and hissing. "Pull!" she screamed, her voice raw. The warriors above hauled on the rope with all their might. Corrina was yanked upwards, her body scraping painfully against the rock face. Below her, the fuse burned with terrifying speed. She scrambled over the ledge just as the world erupted. The explosion was deafening, a gut punch of sound and force that threw her to the ground. For a moment, the entire mountain seemed to groan in protest. Then, with a sound like the world tearing in two, the massive overhang gave way. Tons of rock boulders the size of cabins and a river of shale peeled off the cliff face and plunged into the canyon below. The rock slide was an avalanche of biblical proportions. It didn't just block the canyon, it filled it, sending a tidal wave of dust and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The ground shook so violently that several of Rourke's men on the opposite cliff were thrown from their feet. Their trap had become their tomb. The anvil was sealed forever. Through the settling dust, Corrina peered across the chasm. Rourke was alive. He stood at the edge, his face a mask of incandescent fury, staring at the impassable wall of rock that had just materialized before him. Their plan was ruined. The mammoths and their prize were lost to them. He looked across the canyon, and his eyes met Corrina's. In that moment, a look of pure murderous hatred passed between them, a promise of future vengeance. Just then a new sound reached them, the deep trumpeting calls of the thunder behemoths. From a side canyon just before the rock slide, Coda emerged on a borrowed pony, followed by the magnificent shaggy forms of the herd. They had been moments from walking into the ambush. He looked up at the cliff at Corrina, and then at the colossal pile of rock that blocked the path. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by awe. The battle for the anvil was over. Corrina and her allies had won not with bullets or arrows, but with cunning courage and a few sticks of dynamite. They had saved the herd, but in the process, she had made a mortal enemy of a man who would not forget her face. The dust from the explosion settled, revealing a victory as absolute as the rock wall that now filled the canyon. On the opposite cliff, Clayton Rourke's face was a mask of fury before he and his men retreated, but the promise of vengeance lingered in the air. Corrina had saved the herd, earning the profound, wordless respect of Black Hawk and his warriors. When they returned to Iron Talon's camp, the story of her gambit at the Devil's Anvil spread like wildfire. The old chief approached her, his stern face etched with a gratitude that transcended words. "You have saved our spirit," he said, his voice and low. That night he made his declaration clear. The ghost men will return, and your home is now a target. You cannot go back. We will give you a new home, and our warriors will be your guardians." The offer was generous, a promise of safety. But Corina shook her head, the fire of battle still in her eyes. "I will not be driven from my land," she stated firmly. "My home is my father's legacy. Let it become your watchtower. Let me be your eyes on the plains. In return, teach me your ways, and stand with me when the fight comes." Her proposal was unprecedented, an alliance of equals. Iron Talon looked at the woman who had wielded the mountain's thunder and saw the future. He rose, his voice booming through the camp. "We accept a covenant of dust and sky." Corina's solitary life was over. She was no longer just an orphan on the plains, but a sister to warriors, a guardian of the ancient world. She now had a family, a purpose, and a home worth fighting for. The story of Corina Hayes and the Thunder Behemoths isn't just a tall tale. It's a testament to the unexpected bonds forged in the harshest of landscapes. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it, and that the deepest divides can be bridged by a single act of honor. This chapter of her life closed, but the war for the soul of the Whispering Chasm was just beginning. The West was full of such stories, incredible sagas of survival and alliance that history books often overlook. If this journey into a lost world of the Wild West captured your imagination, please help us keep these stories alive. Hit that like button to let us know, share this video with someone who loves a good old-fashioned adventure, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these incredible legends.